Today, we're joined by Dr. Josh Baer, a research professor who work examines community resilience, disaster response, evacuation behavior, and vulnerable populations. His research provides important insight into how people actually respond during emergencies and what public safety communicators can learn from those decisions. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Robert, for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I met you at a training class, and I'll tell you, I feel like this ongoing relationship that we're going to have and connection is going to be great because you're doing stuff in areas that I'm heavily involved in, and I want to just gather all that knowledge and learn more from you. So I hope
think
we
there's
can
a lot of
continue
synergy
this.
here.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. All right, so your work connects storm modeling, community vulnerability, public health, housing recovery, human behavior. When you look at a disaster response, what do you think practitioners most often underestimate?
I think there's several things. I think that practitioners most often underestimate the complexity of the event and the recovery, the subsequent recovery. And number two, I think they underestimate the length of time it takes to recover from a particular household perspective. It's a long, trudging, painful process for many households. Some households it's much quicker, but for a sizable percentage of our population that are displaced, repairs may seem fairly minor, but the recovery can drag on for months, if not years, before it comes back to anything akin to a new normal.
That's true. And, it's interesting how you think about the recovery part of it. And I look at very frequently other people in the country go, well, why haven't they why are things back to normal? And it's tough to recover from the psychological impact of it's massive, but it's just financially, it's very tough to recover. I looked years ago, several years ago, my son was in Iowa at his college, and I dropped him off, and they got hit by a derecho that traveled 700 miles, 145-mile-an-hour straight line winds, just destroyed the trees and the community around it. And we went back for graduation. Now, this was just under a year later, and there were still trees on the ground that had never been removed.
Right.
And you wonder, why hasn't that happened? Well, it was so devastating. People just haven't gotten to it yet.
Well, I've been to a number of different sites for tornadoes. You mentioned straight line and tornado events, and they call it scarring. As you know, years later, there's still evidence from that straight line wind event or that tornado that came through it. It's scarred physically. But the parallel to that is people are scarred too. And, you cut your skin and you have a scar there. You can see it years later. It's long since passed, but the scar is still there. Physical scars are there. You can still see them from some of these events, but the emotional and psychological scars remain for many, many years. And some of those are multi-generational and passed on to the next generation. So yeah, recovery is kind of a misnomer. An event happens. It's a perturbation that's interrupted normality, but you're never back to normal. From that point on, that's a juncture. You talk about science fiction and there's two parallel realities. That event has changed the track or the course or trajectory of people's lives and communities, the social interaction of that community forever from that point. So do you ever really come back to a normal? That's kind of a misnomer there.
Right. No, I understand that. Josh, for PIOs, what is the danger of saying people ignored the warning when the real issue might be transportation, money, dependency in some way, family networks,
I
things
think
like that?
the real issue with saying that from the PIO's perspective that people ignored the warning. Ignored carries connotations. People did not heed the warning. They heard the warning, but they did not heed it. The reasons for not heeding that warning are very complex, but there's something called bounded rationality. From the PIO's perspective or the emergency management perspective or the politicians, the governor, or the county official telling people, you need to heed these warnings. You need to evacuate. You need to seek shelter. It all makes sense. Your risk is high. You need to move away from risk, whether it's evacuation or sheltering. You need to lower that risk by taking some action. Now, why do they, quote unquote, ignore the warning? Well, from bounded rationality suggests from the individual's perspective, their behavior may actually be quite rational and make a lot of sense. From the aggregate higher picture, from the emergency management PIO perspective, that behavior may not seem rational. It may seem like they're ignoring or they're not heeding and it doesn't make sense. But bounded rationality suggests from the local individual's perspective, their behavior does make sense. They have to balance out the immediate event with bigger picture things. Do they have the resources to evacuate or shelter? For example, they may have evacuated, sheltered in the past, and they're still recovering financially from evacuating. Can they afford to do that evacuation or shelter? There's a disruption to them, and they have to balance out the longer term impact of that disruption. In the immediate time, it may make sense to get out of harm's way, but the longer term, getting out of harm's way has repercussions for things that come in the future for that household. And they're willing to take the risk to stay in harm's way, try and avoid that longer term consequences.
Right, right. So in a compound incident, how should PIOs avoid giving the public messages that sound like contradictory, such as evacuate now and avoid crowds, things like that?
Well, COVID was a pretty interesting world case here in the United States. For the state of Virginia, was commissioned to do a study of compound event of a COVID and a potential evacuation and what some of the issues may be so PIOs could address those head on. And again, from the individual's point of view, if you seeking a shelter or you're evacuating out of the region versus staying sheltering in your home, in your primary home, you are going to interact with more people in that evacuation and or sheltering pathway. If you get in the car, you're going to be in the car with other people. You're going to travel down the road. You're going to stop at gas stations and truck stops and get food and all those things. Eventually, you're going to shelter at a hotel or campground or family house. So by evacuating, you are increasing your probability you're going to cross paths with numerous people when there's a lot of uncertainty with those people with COVID. In addition, if you seek a public shelter, a congregate shelter, there are a lot of people in a fairly small space. So you got to balance that out from the individual's perspective, that risk. So you're balancing the risk. From the PIO's perspective, you really need to, in a compound event like that, you really need to reassure people in that transportation pathway and the sheltering pathway, if you public shelter, that there are reasonable precautions being put in place to try and mitigate exposure to COVID. And I think from a public perspective here at Hampton Roads, a lot of the localities thought ahead and they had plans to mitigate or manage COVID in those congregate shelters. But how was that communicated to the population? So I think on the back end, those steps were being taken, those precautions were being taken, but taking a precaution and not communicating it to the public is like the precaution never happened. So
Right, right.
what PIOs need to do is need to reassure the population that those precautions are being taken in that transportation pathway to exit the region and in the congregate shelters.
I appreciate that. So, all right, so I'm going to shift this to flooding. So, you guys did a lot of research on that. And what role does a person's perception of flooding play in whether they're going to evacuate?
Well, so here you got risk perception versus risk reality.
Yeah.
And there's multiple things that form people's risk perception. At a very high level, the easiest equation would be, an increase in risk perception, increased risk perception translate to increased propensity to evacuate or seek appropriate shelter. But that relationship is moderated by different things. You got resources, your social network, your familiar network. So it gets a little more complicated. So your risk perceptions are formed based on past experiences. Have you experienced a storm in the past? Have you suffered from a storm in the past? Have you been injured, have acute injury or modest injury or a financial loss in the past because of that a storm event, for example? That's your past experience. But you also live vicariously through others. You're embedded in a
Yes.
social familiar network. Has other family members been through events or similar events as this? Have they suffered losses? Have there been acute injuries or perhaps deaths in your family? So you got your lived experiences and you live vicariously through others in your immediate network. And that helps form your risk perceptions. In the
All right.
past, you've been exposed to
o-
these events and you have not suffered a loss, your propensity to evacuate goes down, essentially.
Right. And that's why those people that have survived category 1 or 2 hurricanes have said, oh, I'll be fine. It's only going to be a 1 or 2 the last few times. And what's a 3 big deal, right?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to share a story with you, Robert, just
Sure.
between me and you and the listeners out there. So I lived in New Orleans for a number of years and before I ended up at Hampton Roads. But my father-in-law in New Orleans, I remember talking to him numerous times, educated, smart, well-connected person. And he said, oh, I've been through a dozen of these events. It's all hogwash, it's all
Hmm.
ginned up. The emergency management community and the PIOs and the political, they're all out to make money and they just want to heighten the sense of anxiety about this. So they sell a
Right.
bunch of stuff and, it's a bunch of hogwash. Well,
Hmm.
Katrina was coming and everyone left his house except him. He stayed and he suffered greatly because of his choice to stay. But I remember when he stayed, everyone got out. They ended up coming to Hampton Roads. My family ended up, we had 14 people in my house here, people that fled Katrina. And he stayed and he suffered greatly. And I remember having that conversation with him, thinking of him saying, oh, this isn't going to be a big deal. You remember Fred Sanford and Son?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
This
yeah.
is a big
Elizabeth,
one.
I'm coming
This
to
is a big
join
one.
you.
He
It's a
holds his
big one.
chest.
Yep.
There you go. And I imagine my father-in-law thinking, boy, this really was a big one. I got this one wrong. But by that time, he was stuck. He was on an island in a sense. He was trapped and unable to get out.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Yeah, that's crazy.
So
All right, so for PIO, should evacuation messaging be segmented by household community, medical need, transportation access, neighborhood risk? What do you think?
the answer is, well, yes to all. So first, I'd say you want to reach. You've heard the phrase, you reach people where they are, right?
Right.
You got to know your populations and have a real sense for your neighborhoods and your communities. How do people self-identify? And if you self-identify, we self-identify on a number of different dimensions, a number of different levels. But maybe you self-identify to a particular geography, particular neighborhood, a particular region of the city. Maybe you self identify on descriptive characteristics or socioeconomic characteristics. So maybe you self identify having a disability, cognitive impairment, maybe a mobility impairment. So, whatever it might be, if that's how people identify themselves, you need to communicate with them in that and on that level. Talk to them as a person that lives in a particular part of the city. Talk to them as a person with a disability and communicate through those. So should evacuation messaging be segmented by those characteristics? The answer is yes, because every population has multiple segments and they need to be communicated through different fashions and different pathways for that appropriate for that segment.
Okay. All right. So, all right, I'm going to jump to something else. You did a simulation based disaster. You have a simulation based disaster management framework, and it
Mhm.
looked at housing recovery in Hampton Roads. How can simulation help leaders make better decisions before disaster strikes?
That's a great question, Robert. Well, creating a model is a artificial, but it's a reflection of reality. So you're modeling reality. Of course, it isn't reality, and the more details you have, and the closer it gets to actually reflecting reality, you have a valid model. So creating a valid model, a model that approximates on key dimensions reality, is super important. If you have a model, you can run simulations. You can test how that model performs under different stressors or different
Okay.
conditions. So often we refer to this as modeling and simulation. So you build a model and then you run a simulation. You watch how that model plays out over time. And you can run that model and that simulation multiple times. And each time you run that simulation, you could tweak or adjust or inject different conditions. So the utility of modeling and simulation is that for emergency managers and PIOs is you can see how a recovery may play out if a certain policy, practice, investment or decisions were made under blue skies, for example, well ahead of an
Right.
event. You could say, okay, what if we had this in place? Okay, let's run the simulation. We built the model of our reality. Let's run the simulation and see how the recovery unfolds. Okay, let's go back and run the simulation again, but under these constraints or these assumptions. And you can do that multiple hundreds of times. You can do that thousands of times. And you can identify the optimal basket of interventions, investments, policies or practices and the intensity of those different policy or practices. There's a range of investments and a range of intensity in that policy or that practice. And what is the optimal combination of all those policies, practices, and interventions under blue skies that will lead to the optimal recovery curves for a particular population of interest. So modern simulation give you a sense of, why invest in something heavily and then wait for the event to happen, and then the event happens, and then the recovery plays out, and you say, boy, that didn't really work out. That intervention or that investment we made years ago didn't really play out as we anticipated, right? Well, okay, let's do it again. Well, 10 years goes by and you do it again. It could take you 100 years to figure out what works best. With modeling simulation, you could actually test multiple potential interventions. So you test it out before you buy it, and you can save yourself a lot of time and money and suffering to identify the best policies and practices under blue skies before the event actually happens. So that's advantage of modeling simulation. There's some cost up front and thinking in front and building models and running some simulations, but it can provide some tremendous insights into some of the weak points and the holes and gaps that we have in the preparation for that event.
Excellent. All right, I understand that, and there's some interesting. There's a lot of stuff that can come out of that. So interesting that does repeated exposure to storms and flooding make communities more prepared, or can it normalize risk in a dangerous way?
What it depends on the population and what type of household that you're talking about. But there's some interesting things we know. We've done a number of different social behavioral studies, and we actually go out and talk to populations. We talk to individuals, we talk to households, and we do this leading up to or following an event. So traditionally, when you ask people what they would do in evacuation sheltering, they say, well, if there was a storm and it was a category 3 and it was coming from the southeast, what would you do? And 80% of the people households say, we'd evacuate. Right. But in reality, evacuation rates and sheltering rates are much lower than that. I lost my train of thought, Robert. What was the question again, please?
So the question was, repeated exposure to storms and flooding make communities more prepared, or can it normalize their risk in a dangerous way?
Okay, so yeah, that's really interesting. So in our social and behavioral studies, we found some really curious dynamics. There's something called efficacy, household efficacy, individual efficacy. That's your sense of your ability to manage something that's a trial or some adversity, right? You have a sense of efficacy. I can overcome that. I can do that. I can throw it my way. That's kind of what the idea of efficacy is about. So people that are households that have a high degree of sense of efficacy in managing a storm have lower propensity to evacuate and shelter.
Gotcha.
And a household that has high efficacy and a household that has low efficacy, they're exposed to the same dynamics of that storm from a physical perspective and same destruction, right? And your sense of efficacy doesn't mitigate or lower the destruction that's going to happen to your physical structure. So you want people to have a sense of efficacy, but you don't want people to have a sense of efficacy to the point where they choose not to evacuate when the risk is pretty clear. There's a high degree of risk to the physical environment they're in. Another interesting and curious dynamic we've discovered is that certain households are much more in tune with messaging and preparation messages. So some households, they listen to the Red Cross. We got the go bag, maybe we got the
Hmm.
water. We have a generator. We have 22 cans of green beans on the shelf and 16 cans of baked beans on the shelf and the can opener, by the way. We have everything ready to go. And they're very much in tune to being prepared. They're listening to the message. They're heeding the messages. The problem with that is in a low intensity event, it's good to have green beans on the shelf with your can opener and the water on your shelf. It's a low intensity event. You may be disconnected for 12, 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, right? It's a low intensity event. But in a high intensity event, what you need people to do is you need people to get out of Dodge. They need to leave. They need to get out of harm's way. Well, what we found curiously is those people that are much more in tune to heeding the messages under blue skies, preparation wise, making your household more resilient by having water and a generator and fuel and all these other things, their propensity to evacuate goes way down. So in a low intensity event, sure, you want them to be prepared. But in fact, in a high intensity event, you want that household to get out of Dodge. But
Right.
the people that are
Okay.
most prepared for an event because they listen to messaging, they're most likely to stay in harm's way. So I think from PIO messaging point of view, one of the things that we've identified that's a disconnect, if you will, is you need to communicate people with the preparation is good. Having green beans on the shelf and water is good, but only up to a certain point. And I think that that messaging hasn't been received by the population or adequately communicated by emergency managers or PIOs at this point. If it's a truly devastating catastrophic event heading your way, get out of Dodge. If you're in 8 feet of water, 6 cans, 10 cans, 22 cans, 100 cans of green beans
N-
isn't going to do you
Not
any
going to
good,
matter. Yeah. Not going to matter.
essentially.
Yep.
So that's my long winded answer to your question.
No, I get it. And and we live right now in this era of data. Data that's out there, the weather simulation, all coming together. And is there a point when all that data becomes overload for an official and they forget to think about human behavior?
Well, I think there's so much more relative in the past, so many more visuals from the models of the event, of the impending event as it approaches. And those visuals are played over and over and over repeatedly on the news 24/7. If we're talking about hurricanes, of that severe weather heading your way. That actually gins up loaded language, but increases anxiety of the population. Now you want to increase anxiety of the population because you want them to that translate into action. You want them to take action, remove themselves from harm's way, evacuate, or seek appropriate shelter. But believe it or not, that anxiety has a mental health cost to it. So in the case where you have repeated near misses, repeated storm events, it was going to be the big one, but it veered off a little bit, or it petered out a little bit, or it didn't gain enough steam, you're still inducing a lot of collective anxiety across the population. And doing that repeatedly has public health costs and consequences to it. So having more information, having more visuals is good. Situational awareness is good. But to your point, almost overload with some of those visuals can actually cost the population in terms of mental and public health. And I think, I mean, everything in life is a trade off, right? But I think
Right.
the trade off there hasn't been adequately recognized across the academic community, at least.
Okay. What concerns you have about agencies using AI or predictive technologies to make assumptions about how communities will behave?
Well, AI is here. It's almost in everyone's
Hmm.
workplace in their home.
Not
And
going
if it's
away.
If it's not, it's going to be there tomorrow. Pretty
Right.
much it's here. So I approach that with a little trepidation because it still is, it's not perfect. Let's put it that way. I'm being generous there. Right. And I think the danger here is you're going to look to AI to make some predictions and you're going to base planning or execution or deployment logistics based on what AI is telling you. And if you rely too heavily on that and you at the cost of including or injecting or balancing that with past experience, lived experience, the knowledge base, the body of knowledge of those professionals, the PIOs and the emergency management community, and you just look to AI to help or make and guide those decisions. I think there's some danger to going down that road. It may not be that in the future, but at this point, I have a little trepidation. I'd say just be cautious with relying on AI too heavily to make some of those logistics or staging choices for you.
All right. One of the findings emerging from your from my research is what I call the AI readiness gap,
Mhm.
where technology can move faster than the organization's ready to handle. Do you see a similar gap between the sophistication of modeling and data analysis and the ability for public agencies to operate those findings?
Yeah, so you said it that the technology is leapfrogging and it's growing at leaps and bounds and it's becoming ubiquitous fairly rapidly. So
Mhm.
it's getting ahead of the institutional arrangements to regulate, manage, or even have situational awareness of how it's being used in the workplace or in our communities. And so there's a lag there. And when we see the march of new technology historically, there generally is a lag there. And public institutions generally are bureaucratic. So by their nature,
Mhm.
they're slow to respond. It's like turning a ship. It doesn't happen very quickly, right? And AI is happening relative to other technologies in the past. They get adopted. There's adoption curve. But my perception is that AI is coming on quite rapidly. So that lag time between the institutional capacity to be able to manage and even have situational awareness of how it's being used in the organization. That lag time is fairly large right now. I think some organizations are really scrambling. Some organizations are, this is Josh Baer's opinion here, fairly asleep right now, and they haven't really awakened to the fact that it's being used in the workplace to the extent that it's being used. And to accomplish the work related tasks that the different individuals in their organizations are tasked to do. And those individuals are looking to AI to help them with their work.
Right, exactly. All right, Josh. So your work is between academic research and operational practice. Why is it so difficult to move disaster research into the hands of local emergency managers and PIOs?
Well, I agree that there's some difficulty and some disconnect, but the premise I sense is that disconnect is greater. I'm a glass half full type of guy, and I don't see the disconnect all that insurmountable. If you look at the emergency management community at large, and we find that there's a lot of conferences for emergency managers, local, regional, state, national, and there's a number of different journals that publish emergency management related research, and academics and emergency manager community cross paths quite often. There's a lot of academics that are deployed often. I mean, think about USDA, NSF, there's rapid grants to deploy to
Mhm.
gather perishable data. And those academics are shoulder to shoulder or partnering with community organizations, emergency managers, PIOs in the collection of these data. So I think there's a lot of overlap and interaction between academics and emerging Mac community at large. So I think there is cooperation and that translation of some of the findings that are on the academic side into actionable information for emergency managers does take place. Can it be improved? Absolutely. And I think the more channels we have and the more interaction, from theory to practice type, the better we're all going to be. But I'm a glass half full type guy on that.
All right. If public information officers listening right now could change one thing based on your research, what would you want them to change in how they communicate risk, evacuation, and or recovery?
Goodness. So I would say tailored messaging. Now, this isn't new to PIOs. So who am I, the academic here to be telling PIOs? But the more tailored the message is to the identity, how people self identify, the more likely they're going to listen and act upon that information. So, number one, I would say targeted, tailored messaging. Broad general messaging, fine, but tailored messaging in addition to that, that's targeting particular populations as they self identify. So, and that's number one. But number two, takeaway for PIOs, I would say, is understand the concept of bounded rationality. So people aren't just ignoring your messages. You may be frustrated. We put this out 5 times. We look out our window, the population doesn't seem to be moving. right? They're not taking action. They're not heeding what we're saying. Well, there's reasons for that. People don't want to be at risk. They don't want to be injured, right? But they're obviously balancing a number of different things. So understand the decision calculus from the individual or household level. And if you want to understand that decision calculus, then you can tailor your message and overcome that hesitancy to take action. Provide actionable information to overcome those hurdles. Now we talk about transportation issues, limitations. Maybe there's a medical network that sustains your health, and you're afraid of moving from that. Well, address that in the PIO messages. Be specific, meet people where they are, talk about those hurdles that they know from their point of view, and offer them actionable information to overcome or address those hurdles. We talked earlier about congregate shelters. Tell people that you've got fears about this, that, or other. We've taken action. We've prepared for that specifically. Blah blah blah. Communicate that to the population. They will moderate their behavior and take action. Everyone wants to get out of harm's way. Everyone wants to reduce their risk. No one's interested in being harmed. Provide them the information and provide them the encouragement, and let them know you're talking to them specifically. And Robert, can I say one more thing here that I think
Absolutely.
I see that PIOs and emergency managers don't always get spot on. Yes, we're all individuals. People are individuals. We're one person, right?
Mhm.
But I haven't met very few people that don't make decisions in the context of some social network. You have your family network, familial network, you have your workplace network, you got your community network. And people look to, you are in a network, and there are opinion leaders in your network, and you look to them. So when I make a decision whether to evacuate or not, I don't do that independent of my wife. My wife doesn't make a decision to evacuate or not independent of me. We do it as a unit. So we talk about evacuation sheltering, often we talk about individuals. We need to think about it as some type of unit, usually a family unit. Family units make decisions together. If there's an opinion leader in that family unit that wants to delay the timing of evacuation by 6 hours or 12 hours or wait till tomorrow morning to make the decision, you as an individual in that household may feel the need. We need to evacuate now. I see the risk. Or balancing this decision calculus. I think the risk is great enough. We should evacuate now. Yet you still don't evacuate. Why? Because you're part of that family network. And there's strong opinion leaders in that network. Maybe that opinion leader that says we should wait till tomorrow morning, reassess, and then perhaps evacuate. Maybe that opinion leader is also the breadwinner for that household. For moderate and low income households, if you look at service industry jobs, those service industry jobs don't release their employees until that storm is nearly imminent. I'm a state employee. The storm's 3-4 days out. I can pull the plug. I'll get out of Dodge. I'll take the heat, right? I'm going to have a job when I get back. Service
Right.
employees may not have that opportunity. You're living month to month, check to check. If you leave 2 days early, that's 2 days less of pay in your paycheck. How do you make your rent? How do you pay your mortgage, right? And you're that opinion leader in that household. You're the head of the household. There's other members in that household that may see the risk and may want to get out earlier rather
Mhm.
than later, but you do it as a social unit. There are many families across the nation in coastal areas that have a member of the household that's medically fragile, an elderly member. My mother here in Hampton Roads refused to evacuate. She chose not to evacuate. She was let God, is God's will. If God happened, that is, I'm just not going to go. It's too uncomfortable for me to evacuate. I don't like to travel. I don't know where I'm going to go. It's uncomfortable for me. I'm going to stay. Well, I didn't say, have a nice time, Mom. I'm getting out of here. The storm's coming. I'll catch you in a few days. No, those people are anchors. We call them anchors and tethers. So you stay in harm's way because you want to care for someone who either can't or is unwilling to evacuate or shelter. And this goes beyond family units. Caregivers often develop a relationship with a person they care for. It may not be a direct blood relationship, but you've been caring for that elderly lady or gentleman for a year now, and you choose to stay. They're heat sensitive. If power goes off, they can't manage their medication, they can't manage the heat, they're not going to the doctor. I need to stay to kick. I'm the primary caretaker. I'm going to stay. Well, that caretaker, even though they're not a family member, they choose to stay. But that caretaker has a family that depends on them, and their family in turn stays. We call these tethers and anchors. Protective services, fire and police stay in harm's way. There's families associated with them. They may get the kids out, but the husband or wife may stay also. So I'm just saying, from PIOs and emergency managers to understand the decision calculus from the household perspective, from the individual embedded in the network in the household, there's a lot of factors that are being weighed. And it isn't just an individual makes a decision and the individual gets up and goes to the shelter or goes to get out of Dodge. It's done in the context of a network. And PIOs need to understand, emergency managers need to understand that network, listen to the community, understand those networks, understand the bounded rationality.
I appreciate that. You gave a lot of detail there. All right, so let's change this up, some rapid fire questions.
No, okay, rapid fire, let's go.
Phone call, voice memo, FaceTime. What's your go-to for staying connected?
FaceTime for sure. My go-to is to drive over to meet you one-on-one, but I visually like to see you. It drives me nuts when we have a Zoom meeting, a lot of Zoom meetings the last couple of years, and
Yeah,
half the people, it's just a blank screen. Or if you've had this experience where you have a one-on-one Zoom meeting with one other person and the other person doesn't turn on their screen. So
right. Streaming binge or weekend read?
streaming binge, absolutely. I'm a YouTube person and I love a history. So I'll just,
Morning,
some of those history podcasts can be, 2-3 hours long.
right. Morning ritual or sunrise workout or quiet coffee?
My morning ritual every morning for the last 4 or 5 years is I get up and I do my Spanish. So I've been studying Spanish for 3-4 years now. So it's a
Good for you.
absolute concrete part of my morning every morning. First thing I do when
Excellent.
I get up.
If you could adopt any animal, real or mythical, what would it be?
Any animal?
Any.
Okay. Well, I'd actually adopt a hedgehog. My daughter had hedgehogs when she grew up, and she's obviously a young woman now, and she's moved out. But I really enjoyed those the African hedgehogs.
Nice. What's one song that always gets you moving no matter your mood?
It'd be the Old Rugged Cross. It's a very old song, but the Mills Brothers had a 1950s version where they harmonized it. So the Old Rugged Cross, the answer to that one.
Excellent. Teleportation or time travel, which would you prefer and why?
Time travel. I'd go back to the Victorian era, and there's so much change and new technology coming online. The world was changing so rapidly.
Play it safe or roll the dice. What's your instinct in a crisis?
I play it safe. There's for sure, no, clearly, play it safe.
Which historical figure would you want to shadow for a day and not just meet?
Boy, what great questions. Okay, I would say Samuel Clemens. I'd love to be in with Samuel Clemens the time he was in San Francisco, 1864, 1866, maybe early 1867, that era. He was in San Francisco being a reporter. But in that period, he wrote a story called The Celebrated Jumping Frogs of Calaveras County. He bivouacked at Jackass Hill and Angels Camp when he wrote that. And I would love to shadow Samuel Clemens in that period.
Josh, when we were in training, we talked about a project that you were working on with the city of Virginia Beach. Why don't you talk about it a little bit? Because I think it impacts PIOs, all across the country. So I think what you're working on might have value.
Thanks for bringing that back up. We are working here at Old Dominion University with GMU and Vanderbilt. There's 3 universities, and we have an NSF-funded project. It's a 3-year project, and we're in the first year, and this project addresses communications from PIOs to the citizens of Virginia Beach, relative evacuation and sheltering. The city of Virginia Beach and other cities in Hampton Roads are watching this project closely because it's generalizable. But essentially, PIOs are sending out messages leading up to a imminent storm coming ashore here in the Mid-Atlantic region. And but PIOs don't know if their messaging is being received, being understood, is the messaging being processed, and is there behavioral change? I mean, are people heeding the message and changing what they would otherwise do because of the PIO's message? Hopefully so. But do PIOs actually know that? You'd like to think. And You see the population moving to shelters or evacuating the region, and there's anecdotal information that you're getting back from the city's point of view on the behavior of your citizens. Is that behavior tied to your messaging? Did the message land? That's a big question. Well, you really don't know. You hope so, and you see some movement, right? And sometimes the feedback that the city's receiving on what the population is doing, there's a lag. It's not immediate, and you may see the next day or the population starting to evacuate or uptick in the shelters and stuff, showing up the shelters. But was that natural, or did that have to do with your messaging? And there's a lag. And so the idea of the project is, first off, to map out the communication pathways by which different population segments and different geographies across a city receive messaging. How do they receive the messaging? How do they understand and process that messaging? So what are those pathways by which the message is sent out? And what are some of the pathways in which the city can get a sense on the behavior change? We call this tightening the loop. So there's a feedback loop. Messages go out, people receive it, people adjust their behavior or change what they're doing appropriately or perhaps inappropriately. There's knowledge of that that's fed back to the city, and then the city, the PIOs, can adjust, tailor, sharpen, refine, or re-message, because the storm plays out over a number of days as it approaches. You want to keep messaging, and keep refining that message. So there's a loop there, but the loop is kind of loosey-goosey, if you will. How do we make that loop more intentional, explicit, and how do we tighten that loop so the feedback occurs in near real time? So what the project is doing is it's connecting with the city's existing processes for issuing messages and how do they manage their change in behavior to adjust and station their equipment, open shelters, predicting demand, those type of things. And so what the project does is
I
it
think that
looks at sensors that are out there, flood sensors, traffic sensors in real time. It looks at social media in real time. It does sentiment analysis, and it looks at what people are currently doing and what they intend to do in the next number of hours or perhaps the next morning. And it packages that information, crunches that information, and puts it in digestible, understandable formats for the PIOs and elected officials to understand what's going on in near real time so they can issue more messaging. And that's the loop.
and I think that's important because we always ask, one of the things we always do in the trainings that we do is you say, okay, well, how do you measure, what are the analytics for your messaging? How do you know if it's
Yeah. How
working?
do you?
And a lot of it comes out to be anecdotal because there's a hard way to, it's very hard to analyze
Mm-hmm.
the impact of that messaging, other than the fact that, okay, people show up at shelters if you tell them to go to shelters, or tell them not to cross a roadway when the roadway is
Mm-hmm.
flooded and you don't have anybody drowning. But you don't actually have that feedback that you would be
Yeah.
getting in this case, because you're going to see that if you're telling them to go to shelters and you're adjusting the shelters, and now you see that all of a sudden you get a bigger swarm of people to the shelter that you
Right.
just talked about, now you actually have
Well,
a good
if you're
feedback
able
loop.
to gather data continuously, or even if it's discrete in shorter increments, when a message goes out, you can pick up on an uptick or downtick, a change in behavior. And the proximity between that messaging and that change in behavior or change in sentiment, the fact that it's in a time sense it's closer, leads you to believe that that is a response to that message in particular. Now if your message is going out and the feedback is hours if not a day later, you don't know if A is connected to B. But if it's A happens and the uptick happens B in a short time thereafter, you can surmise that there is a connection between your messaging and that uptick. And that's what we're trying to do, tighten the loop and to have more continuous feedback of that information and continuous real-time or near real-time analysis and crunching of that data as a storm approaches. And that way, we can sharpen the messaging and make sure it lands where it needs to land. And if it takes 2 or 3 tries to tweak that message and resend it out to hit that particular population that isn't mobilized or isn't changing their behavior, this gives you opportunity to do that in near real time.
I like that. I like that. Yeah, that, I think that is definitely going to have an impact. So I will definitely be paying attention to that, those results and the data that you get, because that would definitely be of value to PIOs across the world in any
It's a
fashion,
tough nut to
anything they do.
crack. And other people have attempted research in this area, but when they design a system in the marketplace, consultants, they want to redesign the county or the city system, and they come up with a new system and they hand it off to them. The existing processes for communication, the culture that are in the city, they're not going to throw that out just to take something on that a contractor brought. So we're very cognizant of that, and we're
Right.
building. We're co-designing with the city, and it's going to be integrated with the current practices and the current culture. If we came up with something new, independent, and then we just showed up and knocked on the door, here, adopt this, cities don't tend to adopt those things. So there's other efforts that have happened in the past, but actually being applied and deployed has been the weak point. We're trying to avoid that by co-designing with the existing cities' processes and integrate with those processes. So we're pretty hopeful. And we'll let you know in the next year or two if you want to follow up and have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that definitely will be something that we'll be following up with. Josh, thank you very much for
Okay,
bringing
well,
that to
thank
our
you.
attention. Thoughts? What key points would you like listeners to take from today's interview?
I would say number one, in recovery, there isn't a gap. There's not a gap, but a chasm between the length of time it takes to recover among households. Some households, 2, 3, 4, 5 years following an event, they're still in the recovery mode. And it's hard to believe, but we move on to the next shiny thing, next shiny thing. There are households that are still in
Mm-hmm.
recovery 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I would say just recognize that there's a huge variation in recoveries in the United States. We're a wealthy country. We have the knowledge, we have the technology, we have the past experience, we're organized, yet still there's 10, 15, 20% of the households when they're displaced languish for an incredibly long time. And maybe they never get back to new normal. On the plus side, I would say we as Americans, we are an exceptional country. There's American exceptionalism. I believe in American exceptionalism. And I've traveled a bit. And if you look at recoveries, there are so many faith based and non faith based organic recovery organizations, non-governmental organizations, just self-starters, organizations that come in to help with recoveries. And that I don't see in other countries. Other countries, they have a devastating event and there's a heavy reliance on looking to the government to come in and rebuild and redo things. And certainly there's organic recovery organizations in those environments, but there's far fewer, in my experience, far fewer organic recovery organizations in other countries rather than the United States. That is American exceptionalism on display right there. Be present, have a heart for service, go out and help and volunteer, be part of some of these multiple recovery, whether it's faith-based or not, be part of a recovery organization and participate in that recovery. Address the pain and suffering of displaced households. Be present with those households, just being there and tending to not just their physical needs, but being there to listen. There's a lot of trauma following an event and it lingers. And just being present and holding someone's hand and sitting beside them, as well as doing the physical rebuild and repair and muck and gut and all those things. But just being present is so important to the health of those households. These displaced households has multi-generational impacts. There's disruption to schools, there's disruption to educational attainment, job security, all different things. Having a person there just to be part and walk that path with them as they go through that really rough time and that recovery is super, super important. That's a key point, or points, he said point, that I would like listeners to take away from my discussion today.
Excellent. All right. If people want to follow up or reach out to you, how would you like them to do it?
Yeah, feel free to reach out to me. You can send me an email, jbehr, like the paint company, jbehr@odu. That's for Old Dominion University, odu.edu. Send me an email and we'll connect.
I will add that into the show notes. Josh, thank you for being on the show.
It's been fabulous, Robert. I've really enjoyed it. And God bless you. And thank you for the PIO podcast. It's great to get the information out.